Well, hello everybody and welcome to Jimbo Guitar, where I have a video about the Boss MG-80 guitar amplifier. So far, my videos here have concentrated on the Boss MG-10, a 10-watt guitar amplifier from the late 1980s. But I've also got its big brother, the MG-80, and I thought I would do a facts video to complement the facts video about the MG-10 before I get into any kind of demonstration of me playing guitar through this amplifier. So if you're looking for more information about the Boss MG-80 guitar amplifier, well, hopefully this video can help you. I bought this one second hand in 2019, but I think they were released sometime around the early 1990s. My guess is that Boss saw that the MG-10 was quite popular, but it was very, very small, and somebody decided it was a good idea to make a bigger and louder version. So what I'm going to tell you is what I know about the amplifier from owning one, starting with some basic facts. So the Boss MG-80 is a small, solid-state combo guitar amplifier, meaning it has the speakers and the amplifier in the same cabinet. Although it is bigger than the MG-10, I think it's small in comparison to this 75-watt Marshall 5275 combo amplifier, for example. But we'll talk a bit about that later on. Now, as the name implies, it is an 80-watt combo amplifier, meaning it can output up to 80 watts into its two built-in 6.5-inch speakers. And as with the MG-10, although it has two speakers, and it looks a bit like the stereo Roland JC amplifiers, it is mono. The two speakers are wired together in series to create a mono output. But again, we'll be looking around the back at those later on. The physical facts of the MG-80 guitar amplifier is that it weighs around 13 kilograms, or around 28 pounds, and that is quite a big difference between the Boss MG-10, which weighs 4.9 kilograms, or 10 pounds. So it's nearly 3 times as heavy, and almost certainly that's down to the transformer, and possibly the speakers contributing to how much it weighs, along with the bigger case. Regarding dimensions, the MG-80 is 38 centimeters or 15 inches wide, 24 centimeters or 9.5 inches deep, and 30 centimeters or 12 inches high. I measured the speakers at 5.5 inches on the front, but they're technically 6.5 inch speakers. Now, looking at the front, you can see that it has the same controls as the MG-10, although there are a couple of slight differences. You can spot perhaps that there is a second input, so we have one marked high and one marked low. The high input is the same as on the MG-10, but the low input has some kind of attenuation behind it. And my experience of playing through the amplifier is if you've got very loud or powerful pickups in your guitar, then having this attenuation or load reduces the input going into the amplifier, and this allows you to get a clean tone more easily. If you've seen any of my sound demonstrations of the MG-10, you will know that it distorts very easily, so this is quite a good feature. And it's really no different to turning the volume down on your guitar, except that there doesn't appear to be any change in tone. And having these two inputs is a common feature on lots of amplifiers. Now, the other difference I can see is that the power switch is a push-on, push-off switch, unlike the rocker switch on the MG-10. Cosmetically, the amplifiers look very similar, despite their size, although I personally feel the logo of the MG-80 is slightly different typographically to the MG-10. You might be able to spot the difference in the way the words look, for example. Now, don't be confused by the green colour of the control knobs. I believe when the amplifiers were made, the control knobs were the same identical light blue on both models and will have been the same part. I think that the version that I have here has been in the house of a smoker, and the controls look slightly green because they're stained with nicotine. You can also spot on this amplifier that both the inputs and the phones jack have lost their retaining nuts. It's not altogether clear in the picture, but the only one remaining is the low input, and that is cracked. So clearly, being made of plastic, there's some kind of lifespan to these pieces of hardware, and they eventually split, and I guess they break altogether or they fall off. It would be good to replace these at some point. The whole of the control panel is actually held to the chassis through hexagon nuts behind each of the control knobs, but all the same, you don't want any undue strain from plugging things in and out causing the circuit board to crack. Somebody has attempted to replace the nut on the high input with a metal one. Cosmetically it's not so great, but certainly structurally it's better, and it won't be difficult to find replacements online to replace them, and I'm sure that's something I'll do one day. And whilst we're still looking at this image, you can see it has the same plastic nylon type mesh over the speakers, and it has the same type of vinyl covering on the cabinet, and the same plastic corners as the MG-10. So it really is fundamentally a scaled up version of the original MG-10 amplifier. If we go round to the back, we can see just how scaled up it is. Now, apart from its ability to be louder, one of the big differences I think between the MG-80 and the MG-10 is it is not a closed back cabinet. If you've seen the MG-10 video, you'll notice that it has a closed, sealed back, and it has a port on the front to let the air from the back of the speakers out through the front of the cabinet. Now, although there are panels on the back of the MG-80 cabinet, it is not sealed, and you can see there is a rear panel with a kind of oblong in it. And I think this means that air from the speakers going backwards and forwards at the front, and obviously therefore sound, will also come out of the back of the amplifier as well. There's a lot of debate about this, but it definitely makes for a different overall sound. Now you can also see that the metal chassis of the amplifier is visible at the top, and if we take a closer look at that, you can see one of the differences from the MG-10 is that from the factory, the MG-80 has an external speaker socket. This allows you to plug the amplifier into other guitar cabinets, like 12-inch speakers, 4x12-inch cabinets, or anything you want, as long as the minimum resistance of the speaker is 8 ohms. Again, the retaining nut is showing plastic fatigue and it has a split. There's also a serial number panel telling you that it's 240 volts, and there's a serial number on there, and also the notice that it's made in Taiwan. There's also the usual important safety information on there in English and en français. The risk of electric shock, do not open. Everybody ought to know about that and heed those warnings. Now beneath the chassis there appears to be a transformer and what's called a heatsink. If we take off the first back panel, we are presented with another panel, but you can now see on the top left the transformer and on the top right the heatsink. The transformer is very big and very heavy, but that's because the amplifier is going to be giving out 80 watts. I don't fully understand how transformers work, but my rough understanding is if you want a lot of power, you need a big transformer to efficiently turn the 240 volt mains that we have in the UK into a power supply that can keep the output stage of the amplifier happy. As far as I know, it's always better to over-engineer these things, so you've got a nice big fat transformer, but transformers are made of layers of steel plates, and so there's no getting away from the fact that they just are heavy. And that comb-shaped thing that you can see to the right of the transformer is the heatsink. Now, although solid-state amplifiers don't get as hot as valve amplifiers, where you could probably burn your skin if you were to touch parts of them when they're going at full chat, they do nevertheless create a lot of heat, and the heat needs to be dissipated or let back into the atmosphere away from all of the electronics. So this is just like in a car that has a radiator. You can consider the heatsink to be a radiator, radiating the excess heat created by the power that it's producing and turning that into warm air that drifts away through convection away from the amplifier and keeping it running happily and not overheating and bursting into flames. You can also spot the two speakers, so let's take away that second panel to reveal the back of those. Perhaps you can see something in this picture that looks like hay. This is not a feature of the amplifier. Again, I believe the amplifier was stored somewhere by the earlier owner, where there was some hay or straw, perhaps in a barn or next to the rabbit hutch. Who knows? I don't know. It came from eBay, and there was a lot more hay or straw when I first got it, and for a while it kind of smelt kind of haystacky. So I decided to have a little whiz round with my vacuum cleaner, and now it's nicely cleaned up, and now we can have a look at the speakers. So if we look closer at those, you can see that they are marked Pytone, and they are 4 ohm speakers capable of handling 50 watts each. The long number looks to be a product code number. The internet doesn't have a lot of information about Pytone speakers. All I could find was that they came from Taiwan. So I expect they were a reliable local supplier for Boss and Roland for their Taiwan manufacturing base. Now if we take a closer look, they are wired in series, meaning that 2 4 ohm loads at 50 watts become a single 8 ohm load capable of taking 100 watts. Again, over-engineering is probably a good thing. There is a lot to be said about loads and impedance and speakers and output, and I'm not an expert in this regard, so I'll leave it at that for the time being, but I hope that it demonstrates that to make a bigger combo, you often need a bigger box and more power. Now, before I close up the cabinet, I suspect, like the MG-10, it's made of particle board, although the inside is black, unlike the unfinished particle board inside of the MG-10. Certainly the two panels on the back are particle board, but I noticed that the pieces of wood into which they are screwed are real wood, because I suspect that that's got a better structural strength than the particle board. The two black panels are covered in a kind of hard plastic melamine type laminate, although over the years it seems to be falling apart a bit. Now, as I was taking it apart, I did think a lot about the construction of the back of the cabinet and whether the two panels were meant to do some kind of folding of the sound like a horn type speaker. But on reflection, that would require the rest of the cabinet to be sealed, and with all of the air that will be lost through the chassis of the amplifier and elsewhere, what I actually think is that the back of the amplifier is designed to be able to store the mains cable safely without it damaging the speakers. It was a bugbear of mine about the MG-10 that you can't put the cable away anywhere, and this feature seems to work quite well on the MG-80. Of course, stating the obvious, it is a mains powered amplifier, and the amp is hardwired. There is no way to unplug the cable. It comes in my case with a moulded 3-pin UK plug for our 240 volt power supply. After all of this investigation, I also think the obvious thing about the amplifier being bigger and therefore producing more heat and needing to get rid of that heat is that a sealed closed back design wouldn't be efficient in that regard, and it would mean that the amplifier would fail because we couldn't get rid of the heat efficiently. So in summary, I can tell you without playing it in front of you that this is a much louder amplifier than the MG-10, but its size still means that I think it would struggle with a real-life drummer, and it might even struggle to be heard over a full band. But it is a very shrill-sounding amplifier, and shrill sounds travel much faster than heavy bassy sounds. Now, there is a lot of science about perception of sound and so on that I'm not going to go into here, but like I say, this is very loud, but by sheer design, it's a bit of an oddball compared to the type of amplifiers you can buy today. There'll be more to say about that when we get into playing demonstrations, but merely as a fact, it is louder than the MG-10, but compared to the Marshall, it is not as loud. And that's a 75 watt amplifier with 5 less watts. But you should know by now, of course, that watts are a unit of power and don't equal decibels. There are all sorts of things that go into why an amplifier is loud or not. I don't think there's any difference between valve watts and transistor watts, incidentally, but there are very different, definite differences between the components that make up a combo amplifier, including the speaker, the transformers, the output stage, and it's how all of those are balanced and put together in a kind of recipe that the manufacturer uses that gives a combo its volume, overall sound, and character. Anyway, you don't always want deafeningly loud volume, and there are various reasons why you might want this amplifier. I would say if you can find one for a reasonable price, you should get it, as it certainly won't take up much space. But it is heavy, so if you can't collect it yourself, it might cost you a lot to get it delivered. Again, I'll talk more about all of that when I get round to making a playing demonstration, but for now, these are the facts I know about the Boss MG-80. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think.